Lenora Birch was 41 years old when she opened a sympathy card addressed to her ex-husband and found, folded inside it, the obituary of a woman she had been writing checks to keep alive for 3 years. She had been sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in March when the card arrived in the stack of mail she still received at the house on Caldwell Street in Memphis. The house that had been hers before the marriage, hers during it, and hers after it, because she had made certain of that when the marriage ended. The envelope was pale blue and addressed to Mr. Desmond Birch, forwarding address unknown, return to sender crossed out in the handwriting of someone who didn't know he had moved. She had not opened it intending to read what was inside. She had opened it because she had been paying for Desmond's mother's dialysis treatments every month for 3 years at Desmond's request, and because the return address on the envelope was the nephrology clinic on Poplar Avenue where those payments went. The obituary was dated February of 3 years prior. Frances Birch, 71, had passed peacefully at Memphis Methodist Hospital, survived by her son Desmond and the members of her church congregation. The service had been held at Greater Temple Baptist on a Saturday morning in February, 3 years ago, which was 4 months before Desmond had called Lenora from an area code she didn't recognize and told her that his mother had taken a turn and that the treatments were getting expensive and that he was between things right now and that he knew it was a lot to ask. She had been writing checks of $1,400 a month to the clinic for 36 months. The clinic, it turned out, had no record of any patient by the name of Frances Birch. She had paid $50,400 into an account number Desmond had given her over the phone, and the account number was not the clinic's, and Frances Birch had been dead for 3 years and 4 months, and Desmond had known. What Desmond had not known, what he had never known, because she had decided in the first year of the marriage that the private architecture of her financial life was not something she was willing to share with a man who had never demonstrated he understood its value, was that Lenora had spent the last 8 years building a commercial property management company that now operated 17 properties across the Memphis metro with a gross annual revenue that would have made the $50,400 look exactly like what it was. Not a sacrifice, but a theft he had committed from someone with resources he had never thought to ask about. The theft was documented. Every check was documented. Every transfer was in her records. She picked up her phone and called her attorney. What happened next would cost Desmond Birch a great deal more than $50,400. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. She had always been the kind of woman who kept records. Her father had instilled it in her before she understood why it mattered. In the methodical way he had instilled most of the things that mattered, not through instruction so much as example, the way he had kept his own files in a cabinet in the spare bedroom of their house in Orange Mound. A cabinet with 4 drawers organized by year and subject. Everything labeled in his small and precise handwriting. He had been a licensed electrician for 35 years, running his own shop from the time she was 9, and he had told her more than once that the difference between a man who owned his work and a man who merely did it was the paper trail. You did the work, and then you documented the work, and then the documentation was the proof that the work had been yours. He was 74 now, and still sharp and still kept the cabinet, though the shop had been sold a decade ago. She had called him from the driveway the morning she found the obituary, before she called anyone else, because he was the first person she wanted to hear. He had listened to everything she said. When she finished, he was quiet for one moment, and then he said, "You kept the checks?" "Every stub," she said, "every transfer record. 36 months. "Then you have him," he said. "Let the attorney do the rest." She had made her coffee and sat at the kitchen table she had chosen herself for a house she had owned before Desmond was in it, and she had received the morning the way she had been trained to receive difficult things, without haste, with complete attention, with the understanding that what the situation required was precision rather than reaction. The house on Caldwell Street had been her first independent purchase, bought at 31 from the savings she had accumulated since her mid-20s when she had started working in property management for a firm in Midtown Memphis, and had understood, within the first 6 months, that the people who built wealth in real estate were not the ones who managed other people's properties, but the ones who owned them. She had kept managing other people's properties for 4 more years while she assembled the capital and the knowledge and the credit profile to begin acquiring her own. And she had purchased the Caldwell Street house as her residence and simultaneously optioned a small commercial strip on Summer Avenue as her first investment property. Her grandfather had planted the pecan tree in the backyard of Caldwell Street 40 years ago. It predated her ownership of the house and would outlast it, and she tended it with the same care she brought to everything she maintained because it had been his, which made it a kind of inheritance she had not been given in a document but had earned by choosing the house that held it. She had met Desmond at a neighborhood association meeting in 2016. He was in insurance sales, personable and well-dressed and attentive in the direct and specific way that she had once read as genuine interest and now understood to have been professional habit. He had asked her about the Caldwell Street property and what she paid for it and how long she had owned it in a way that felt like conversation rather than assessment, and she had answered without examining the distinction closely enough. They had married in 2018. She had kept her financial life separate, not from suspicion, but from the principle her father had modeled: your work is yours. The property management company Birch Street Properties, which she had named before the marriage and kept in her own name throughout it, operating under her maiden name professionally as she always had, was not a secret she kept from Desmond so much as a compartment she maintained out of the same deliberate habit with which she maintained everything. He knew she worked in commercial real estate. He knew she owned some properties. He had not asked the specific questions that would have produced the specific answers, and she had not volunteered what was not asked. He had left in 2020. Not dramatically, there was no scene, no confrontation, no discovered betrayal at that time. He had simply become someone who was gradually less present, and then one morning was gone, with a conversation that lasted 12 minutes and a bag that was already packed. She had understood from those 12 minutes that the marriage had been over in his mind for some time before it was over in the room, and she had filed for divorce without additional discussion because she was a woman who dealt in facts, and the fact was clear. The 4 months that followed the departure had been the process of the process: attorneys, documentation, the clean separation of a financial life she had maintained separately throughout, and which was therefore not difficult to divide because there was very little that had been joined. He retained his car and his accounts. She retained the house, the company, the properties, and the financial architecture she had built in her own name across 11 years of deliberate work. The divorce was final in November of 2020. In February of 2021, Desmond called. She had answered because he was her ex-husband and because she had not yet had reason to stop answering, and he had explained the situation with his mother in the tone of a man who was genuinely embarrassed to be asking but had nowhere else to turn. She had known Frances Birch. Frances Birch had been a small and dignified woman who had been kind to Lenora at the wedding and who called her once a year at Christmas. The dialysis, Desmond said, had been ongoing since a health event the previous fall. The clinic billing was outpacing what he could manage. He was not asking for himself, he said. He never asked for himself. That was the construction. She had transferred $1,900 the following week to the account number he texted her. She had done it because Frances Birch was a real person she had known, and because she was a woman who had resources, and because her father had raised her to understand that resources were for using and not only for accumulating. She had continued for 36 months because nothing had given her reason to stop. The sympathy card gave her reason. Her attorney was a woman named Delphine Carter, who had offices in the Crosstown Concourse and who had handled Lenora's business legal affairs for 7 years. Delphine did not specialize in criminal law, but she knew who did, and she made the calls before Lenora's first meeting with her was over. They met the morning after the card arrived. Lenora brought the obituary, the sympathy card, the 36 months of transfer records she had pulled from her files the previous evening, and a printed statement from the nephrology clinic on Poplar Avenue confirming that no account in the name of Frances Birch or under the account number Desmond had provided had ever existed in their system. Delphine looked at everything in sequence. She asked 2 questions. Do you have any documentation of his requests? Text messages, emails, every text, Lenora said. I kept them. And the transfers? They came from your personal account? My business account, Lenora said. I have the QuickBooks records for every one. Delphine set her pen down. This is wire fraud, Lenora. Potentially elder fraud statutes depending on how the district attorney wants to characterize the fabrication of a living dependent. She paused. The documentation you have is exceptionally strong. You have a paper trail a prosecutor would be grateful for. I keep records, Lenora said. I know, Delphine said. That is what is going to cost him. The criminal referral went to the Shelby County District Attorney's Office within the week. Delphine had a colleague there, a prosecutor named Aldrich, who handled financial crimes and who reviewed the file and called Delphine within 48 hours to confirm that the case had been opened. Desmond was not in Memphis. It took the investigator assigned to the case 11 days to locate him in Little Rock, which was where the area code had been from when he called in February of 2021. He had been in Little Rock the entire time, which meant that for 3 years and 4 months he had been calling from Arkansas to report on a mother who was buried in Tennessee. She called her father on a Friday evening after the referral had been confirmed. He was in his kitchen when he answered. She could hear the sound of the television in the background, and she told him what Delphine had set in motion. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 36 months. Yes, she said. He sat with it for 36 months, her father said. There was something in his voice that was not anger exactly, but was adjacent to it in the way that certain tools sit adjacent to each other in a cabinet, different purposes, same material. And the whole time you kept the records. I always keep the records, she said. I know you do, he said. I taught you that. Another pause. He had no idea what he was stealing from. She had thought about that herself, in the evening since the card had arrived, the particular quality of what Desmond had not known. He had not known about the company. He had not known about the properties. He had not known about the annual revenue or the financial structure she had spent 11 years building with the same patience her father had brought to 35 years of electrical work. He had seen the house on Caldwell Street, and a woman who was in commercial real estate in some modest capacity, and he had made his assessment and he had not updated it. And his failure to update it was the reason he had believed $4,100 a month was a meaningful sacrifice for her, rather than a line item she had absorbed without financial disruption while she ran 17 properties across the Memphis metro. He had stolen from her without knowing what she was. That was not a mitigating factor. But it was a fact she found clarifying in the way that accurate diagnoses were clarifying regardless of whether they were comfortable. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. She had properties to manage. The criminal proceeding took 13 months. Desmond had returned to Memphis when the warrant was issued. She did not know the circumstances of his return and did not seek them, and had entered a plea arrangement in the 14th month that included restitution of the full $50,400, structured payments, and 3 years of supervised probation. The restitution schedule was documented, binding, and enforceable, and Delphine had reviewed the structure of the enforcement provisions with the same precision she brought to every document she touched. Lenora had not attended any of the proceedings. She had not needed to. She had submitted her documentation to the prosecutor's office at the outset and had answered 2 questions from Aldrich in a single phone call, and had thereafter managed her properties and conducted her business and let the legal process do what legal processes were designed to do when. The documentation was in order. 14 months after the sympathy card arrived, she was standing in the backyard of the Caldwell Street house on a Saturday afternoon in May, beneath the pecan tree her grandfather had planted 40 years ago, assessing the south fence line where she had decided over the winter to build a raised bed. She had the measurements on a notepad she had brought outside. She still used paper for certain things, a habit from her father, and she was checking the grade with a level she had borrowed from the 3rd drawer of his cabinet, which was the same drawer it had lived in for 30 years and which she always asked before taking and always returned by the following weekend. The 18th property had closed in April. The company's gross revenue had crossed a number she had written down on a piece of paper when she was 33 and put in the bottom drawer of her own cabinet as a marker, not a deadline, not a demand, just a number that told her she had built what she intended to build. The number was in that drawer now behind 11 years of documented work, and the actual revenue was above it, and she had looked at that paper in April and then filed it again, because the point had never been the number. The point had been the work. There was a man named Philip in her life, a commercial contractor she had worked with on the renovations for 2 of the properties and who had, over 18 months of professional contact, become someone she wanted to talk to in the mornings before the day started. He was methodical and exacting, and he documented everything he built with the instinct of someone who had learned early that the work was only as real as the record of it. He had met her father in January. Her father had shaken his hand and said, "You keep your paperwork straight," which was not a question, and Philip had said yes, and her father had said, "Good man," and that had been the entirety of the assessment, which was the entirety of what was needed. She wrote down the measurements for the raised bed and put the notepad in her pocket and looked up at the pecan tree, which was in the 3rd week of its spring leafing and which was doing exactly what it had always done, producing without announcement, the way things produced when they had been properly established and left to work. She had built everything worth keeping, and she had kept every record of how she built it. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.